obviously. So I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I hope some of you had come to our seed starting program that was last month already with Jennifer. It was amazing. And I hope if you did come, you started some seeds. I did, and mine aren't doing very well. I'm so sad.
Uh-oh.
I know. I'm still keeping my fingers crossed here I'm hoping. But we'll get started. And just a couple of ground rules. Like I said, please keep your mics muted. And then if you have questions during the program, please go ahead and type those in the chat. And I will then read those questions to Jennifer at the end of the program. But yeah, feel free to put those in the chat and I'll get to them at the end of the program and we'll get your questions answered. Other than that, I'm going to get started. I'm going to introduce... Oh, Jennifer, you got to remind me of the last name again.
Lazewski.
Lazewski. It's spelled Lazewski. And I'm like, that's not right. Lazewski.
All right. I answer to any of the above.
Well, thank goodness. Okay, we want to welcome you to Be Aware, Attracting Local Pollinators and Native Bees. And our presenter tonight is, excuse me, Jennifer Lazewski, and she is a UW-Madison Division of Extension volunteer with the Southwest Wisconsin Master Gardener Association. She is the founder and chairperson of its educational Pollinator Group, an experienced butterfly and hummingbird gardener before becoming a Master Gardener volunteer. She continues to add native plants and shrubs to her small urban Wauwatosa yard and delights in the expanding population of insects and wildlife that visit her garden. She also works on bumblebee monitoring and other community science projects with the DNR, local park systems, and nature center programs. So welcome, Jennifer. I'm excited for your Be Aware program. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much and welcome to everyone. Thank you for attending today. I'm very excited to have this opportunity to talk about butterflies, bees, hummingbirds, a few other things, and how we can help build our yards for them and bring them into your yards and create our own little ecosystems. So you'll give me a second to pull things up. I have been a gardener for almost 15 years now, but I came into pollinator gardening by way of butterfly gardening, which expanded into butterflies and hummingbirds. And currently I am kind of specializing in native bees. So we'll have some information on them here also, because people are understanding more and more how important they are. And they really are important to both our local systems and pollinators in general, to our agricultural food systems as well. So this little guy in the middle here was actually taken in my yard. So one of the funnest things about having these plants is having this wildlife coming into your yard and getting a chance to see them up close and personal and take photos of them, learn to identify them. So it's kind of my little meditation time in the morning when I'm watering some plants, or when I've come home from work. I'll sometimes just take 10 or 15 minutes to walk around the yard and see what's going on. So when you're planting these plants, you're doing more than just the plants. You're creating activity in your yard and other things that you can enjoy as well. So the basics of pollination is just connecting male and female so that it can create an egg, which basically is a seed. So that represents the next generation of plants. So some plants have both parts, and some can self-pollinate. They're in different parts of the plant. But really, you're better off with cross-pollination whenever possible for genetic diversity and for kind of moving things along. So some plants can do all this work themselves, but most, as we'll talk about, benefit from having animals that help them move these things around from one spot to another and one group of plants to another for that cross-pollination too. Why is it important? Well, if you don't have good pollination, you don't get seeds, if you have no pollination. But also when we're talking about growing fruits and vegetables, incomplete pollination, you don't have a full good fruit. So for something like a raspberry, every single one of those flower parts has to be individually pollinated in order to get a full raspberry with all the fruit all the way around. So the same thing with the cucumber, you see all those seeds, each part of it is individual pollination. And really where it benefits is by having multiple bees come through multiple times, so that they can really get every piece of that. So if you just have one bee come through once, they might hit some of it. You really need multiple bees, multiple visits. So that's part of why it's important to have as many around as you can. And even though some things in food systems and plants, a lot of the trees, as we know, because pollen is surrounding us in the air right now, are wind pollinated. But even a lot of things that are wind pollinated or self-pollinated can benefit from having those added interactions with bees and other pollinators that help specifically move that pollen around. So the pollinators are the animals that help transfer the pollen from male to female. And most of them, they just do it as kind of happenstance. You can see a really good example with the hummingbird on the left, where you can see the two parts of the plant, and the longer one is where the pollen is, so it's going to end up on the back of the hummingbird's neck, while it reaches in really far to get that nectar. So nectar is a reward that the plants have created to try to achieve pollination. So it's kind of this sweet treat that attracts the pollinators, and it is purposeful on the part of the plant, at least in terms of evolution. And so that draws insects and birds in, and then the pollen gets moved around as they go from plant to plant. So not all of these are perfect pollinators. So they have some drawbacks. You can see the butterfly is kind of up above the center of the coneflower, which is where the nectar and the pollen is. So it's not having good contact with it, for example. And then the beetles, although they are all over the pollen, they sometimes eat parts of the plant, including some of the reproductive parts of the plants as they move through. There's also not necessarily a constancy to the flowers that they go to. Hummingbirds go to the highest value nectar plants, and so they can skip around the yard going from plant to plant. Same thing with butterflies and beetles. The things that are really the best pollinators, because they are specifically looking for pollen and nectar that they use to create, both that they eat themselves and that they create with their nesting, for their young to eat as they're growing. So they are purposefully gathering that pollen and nectar, and they do tend to stay within a flower. If it's something that's flowering at the time and there's a fair amount of it around, they're just going to go from plant to plant if it's a good food source. So on the right, in the middle is our honeybee, kind of one of the prime examples, not a native bee. We're going to talk about that. But you can see the pollen in its pollen basket in that big kind of ball on its leg. Bees also hold it in other ways. So you see one that has it on the bottom of its abdomen on the left side. And then on the right side, one that's legs that are so full of pollen that you can barely tell apart its leg hairs from the rest of the plant. So they really gather up that pollen. They have features that help them do that. They're hairier. They kind of have a little bit of an electric charge to them. And they tend to groom themselves to put it where it needs to go. Because for female bees, they're trying to transport that back to their nest where they're building things for their young. This is a campaign that Whole Foods had a couple of years ago, to show what their produce department looks with and without bees. So some of the things that we love to eat and are most important to the nutrition and the variety that we have in our diet are a result mostly of bee pollination. So 1/3 of the food we eat requires pollinators. In Wisconsin, we're also especially cognizant of that because we are an agricultural state. You think about cranberries, apples, cherries, blueberries. We have a lot of industries where that pollination factor is extremely important. And that's besides whatever you're doing in your home gardens or working with local food. The bigger number has to do with all the crops where we don't necessarily directly eat the fruits and seeds that arise from pollination. So things like in the cole family, broccoli, kale, things like that. And then we have lettuce that's gone to seed on the right, all your root crops. What we consume is not directly from pollination, but you wouldn't have the next generation of those vegetables without pollinators. They still create the seeds for those plants. So they are still important. And that goes also for some of the grains that may be wind pollinated and things like that. They are still important in the process. Another thing that not a lot of people know about in Wisconsin is how important alfalfa is to the dairy industry. Dairy cows consume alfalfa as an important part of their winter feed. And that's a plant that doesn't, that requires certain bee pollination. It has a very difficult trigger mechanism to get that pollen out and to create those seeds and therefore, the alfalfa that the cows are eating. I started to mention with local food that whether it's small farmers or what you have in your home garden and the plants that we have in our yard, in our nature centers, all of those places, local things need local bees. Bees don't fly very far. Honeybee hives, a honeybee can fly a mile or two, but they're kind of the exception. Bumblebees may fly up to a mile, but most of the time they're not doing that. And when you're talking about tiny bees, like the little, either looks like it's probably a sweat bee in the prairie sunflower there, Heliopsis, they don't fly very far at all. So ideally they want to find nesting nearby, good floral resources, and they'll stay there from generation to generation. We'll talk about the life cycle of solitary bees in a little bit. One of the biggest bee people nationally, Sam Droege, who works with the U.S. Geological Service, says your yard is like Yellowstone Park to a bee. So it's really this vast territory for them, and you want to have them keep coming back. You don't want them to go somewhere else to feed. They might not make it back. So there's been a lot of talk about pollinator decline. Some of it is connected to honeybees and colony collapse disorder, but also insects are on the decline. There's been a number of articles and scientific studies coming out about that. So in some instances, pollinators are similar to a lot of other animals where wildlife is just having a very difficult time due to habitat loss, areas that are converted for development, or farming, or something that I hadn't thought about until it's been talked about more often, gas and oil in a lot of areas is clearing things out. So that's, a big human contributor to losing areas and also having disconnects in habitats. For more for animals than necessarily for bees, when you have great distances between small habitats, you don't get that crossover in genetic diversity also. This is an example of a honeybee with that little brown thing that's on its back is a varroa mite. And that's a tremendous problem with honeybee hives and the health of honeybees. It actually makes a little hole in their hard exoskeleton that allows other diseases and funguses to come in. So the varroa mite itself doesn't necessarily kill the honeybee, but they have gotten more and more prevalent. They're very difficult to kill with pesticides, and it's becoming a bigger factor in how well, a colony can do. So that's one example from honeybees. Bumblebees have an intestinal pest called nosema that has affected them and spread to wild populations also. So there are a number of things that can affect the health of bees, aside from, direct predators and things like that. Pesticides, this is an example of a blooming orchard, probably an almond one from what I remember, where of course, because of the time, fungicides have certain timings and certain conditions where they're trying to reduce the diseases that can affect the trees. And so they're spraying right in the middle of when the blooms are there and bees are there. So there are often competing, you know, things that have to be done. And sometimes it's just a mistake. I think almost everybody's heard about some of the big bee kills in Oregon over a parking lot. And I think more recently there was another one where the companies that are coming in to spray for things don't understand that you can't do that when a linden tree is blooming because it's full of bees. You know, those kind of basic things. So hopefully we're making some headway on education with that. But there also is information that not just insecticides that directly kill insects, mosquito spraying is another thing where it kills all the insects, not just the mosquitoes. But there are also combinations of herbicides and fungicides can also have an effect on the health. There are scientific studies coming out about how much of that is in honeybee honey and in the honeybees themselves. It can accumulate and affect their longevity, their reproductive health, and their ability to fly and navigate. So just combinations of things can have results also. And more recently, there's to be some studies coming out about the effects of climate change. As things get warmer, basically a lot of animals and insects are moving up in altitude or up further north. So they're trying to find places that are a little bit cooler. So this is an example of a butterfly where their range is actually shifting. So butterflies generally, you know, fly longer distances, can migrate, have the ability to do that, as do other animals. Bees, however, not being able to fly very far and having either a solitary lifestyle where they kind of come in and out of the same areas each generation if they have good habitat, or bumblebees do colonies that don't move very far from where they started originally, then they're kind of caught in a little bit more of a vice. They're not necessarily shifting to adapt to temperature or in some cases plant movements. So what can we do to help them? In Wisconsin, we have one of the earliest adopted pollinator protection plans that tell us some of the basic things that both beekeepers can do, homeowners, larger landowners, they each have a separate section. So for gardens and lawns, they give us a list of the things that are kind of most important that we can do to help boost pollinator numbers and protect them. Most important thing always when you're dealing with plants, right plant, right place. I cannot say that enough times. As gardeners, we violate that all the time, especially when you're starting out and you think, oh, I can try it here, or I can move it there. But really, when you're putting it in the right sun and soil conditions for that plant, you have the healthiest plant. It's less prone to diseases, it grows best, and it blooms best. So you really want to pay attention to what the label tells you or what you're double checking online or in other guides about where that plant really should ideally be. A variety of flower colors. We're going to talk some about what the different pollinators can see and what they respond to. So as with a lot of things with pollinators, because there's so many different pollinators, different sizes, that you really want to look for variety, and your flower colors is one of those things. Most important thing, as I said, you want to try to keep pollinators in your yard and around so that whenever you've got tomatoes to be pollinated or whatever else is going on, they're already there. You want to have at least 3 and ideally more like 5 to 6 things flowering at the same time. So you can do that with your trees and shrubs. Like around this time of year, there aren't too many plants that are blooming yet. But if you look up, you've got cherries and willows and a number of other things blooming. Then kind of that next round will be a lot of the shrubs. before you start seeing as much on the ground that's, longer blooming things. It also includes any fruits and vegetables you have in your yard. Annuals are a great way to bridge some of those gaps. And if you let some of your herbs flower, that's actually one thing it's a favorite for a lot of pollinators, but also for beneficial insects. So if you're trying to keep your yard pesticide free, letting your basil go to flower, or your bok choy, leaving a couple if you didn't catch them in time. Cilantro is something that notoriously bolts very quickly. Once it starts flowering, it just goes really quick, but don't necessarily pull it and throw it out. That's something that will bring in some of those smaller insects when it's blooming. Native plant species are very important. We're going to talk about that also a little bit later in more detail. And it's really that native insects are adapted to over centuries working with native plants. So whether it's a caterpillar that eats a certain leaf or a certain family of plants, or you're talking about, grasshoppers, or, and almost anything. And you look at how hummingbirds are adapted to certain flowers. Some of those connections are very, very important. And also having non-native things kind of leaves you with a desert. There are things that are not going to be used very much by any of the wildlife or insects that are around. And then things to avoid. Invasive plants. This time of year, we're all seeing our dandelions, which, are a little bit controversial, but it's not something that you should intentionally plant. There's a difference between saying it's okay to let them bloom because the bees will use them, and going out to intentionally plant an invasive plant. And you want to get rid in your yard of things like buckthorn and garlic mustard and other things that will spread very easily. When you're starting off building pollinator gardens or any type of garden, it's really important that you try to eliminate those as much as you can before you're doing something new, because otherwise you'll spend a lot of time continuously trying to get them out. Highly modified cultivars, where you're going to see some specific examples on that. But generally, again, for pollinators and other insects, you want to stick as close to the original native plants as possible. One of the things that's suggested here that's becoming bigger and people are more interested in it is we have all this lawn space. So if you're not going to take out your lawn to put in more plants, which would be the first recommendation, then at least try to tend your lawn in a way that's more friendly for pollinators and other insects. So you can let those things bloom, doesn't mean you have to let them go to seed, but also to make sure that if you are going to treat things in the lawn, that you mow first and take out any flowers that insects might be on before you're doing any lawn treatments. When you're looking at how to design your pollinator garden and things you should think about, and you can do it either by adding plants to what you already have or starting new. There's no right way or wrong way to do this. And I'm somebody that started off with a very traditional garden and just kind of kept expanding and expanding what natives were there and making choices at every point when you're replacing a plant that didn't do well, or thinking about how you want to redo this section. Think about those choices and do some research as to what you want to be putting in. But specifically for pollinators, you want to try to have large groups of the same plants so that it's not wasted energy. They're not going to come in and just have one thing that's blooming in one plant. And that's another reason kind of about larger groups of the same or similar colors helps draw them in. You'll see that particularly with butterflies. But if they see kind of big masses of things, they're more likely to stop and visit your yard. And then, and as I was started to say, with large groups of the same plants is you want to give them a lot of nectar and pollen energy for their trip. So you want it to be a net plus when they come into your yard. Not that they have to spend so much energy going to 3 corners across your yard for 3 separate plants. But there are 2 ways that you can do that. The example on the left and kind of above is from the border at Allen Centennial Gardens. There are some non-native plants in there, but this has a lot of pollinator plants, and it's done kind of in a matrix planting, and it's done with plants that can handle dry conditions because they don't like to water that garden at all after the first year when it's established. So you can see there are some grasses in a pattern, some alliums, the white is calamintha, and in the springtime, there's a lot of salvias in there. Kind of things pop up. There's usually 2 or 3 things blooming at any given time, and they're all kind of in a wave pattern. So you can do things in a very designerly way, but you can also do it like the prairie at the UW Arboretum. You know, you'll see clumps of the same flower kind of spread throughout. So they don't all have to be just in a big group. You can spread them out, you know, within that space, but just so long as it's not, you know, 200 yards over. So it's, again, it has proximity, but you can do that in different ways. So when we talk about colors that pollinators can see, this gives you an example based on the, you know, the color chart where different pollinators can see and what they respond to. So insects can see ultraviolet light, you see on the far left, and we'll give you some examples of that. Animals cannot, so hummingbirds don't. Butterflies can see everything from UV all the way through to red. Bees do not typically respond to red and orange. They will still see it's there, but they'll see it more as black and something that's less attractive. They'll also still smell it. You know, the insects have chemical sensors that give them a sense of smell. So you will still see bees on red flowers, but it's not what they're as likely to respond to. And then hummingbirds have the whole visible spectrum pretty much that they work with. But surprisingly, they're not so much in the middle. They're not as attracted to yellows, greens, and whites. So when we talk about ultraviolet, we can't take an exact photo, but these are some representations on the left of what the flower looks like to us, and then what it looks like under ultraviolet light. So for both of these instances, we're talking about what's called nectar guides. As part of that kind of plant evolution of they want the insects to come and get nectar, they're also making a point to make sure the insects can find it. So they give them these bright colors, these patterns that draw them into the middle of the flower, or as on the far right, what I call it the runway guide. You know, here, go right there, follow those stripes. And so it's also the same thing under ultraviolet. They're trying to create it so that the insect can see clearly where they're supposed to go to the center of the flower, where the nectar and the pollen are. In trying to set up that scheme of having 3 to 5 things blooming at the same time, this is an example of a bloom chart that I've created for my backyard with just my native plants. So I have a small yard, and I promise I do have more than one of these things in there too. But this is kind of the scheme of how things work. And as you're planning a garden or a section, I have found this to be a really helpful tool. So you can look up when plants are supposed to be blooming. Usually by month is about as close as you can get to that. But if you're curious, Berner actually has a big spreadsheet every year that's done by my fellow Master Gardener volunteers that says what's blooming when. So you can also go through that to match some things up. But I've just replaced when the months that they bloom with about the color that they are. So I can also kind of keep track of, okay, what color is it? Who's going to be attracted to it? And if it's white, it's got that extra little box around it, since I can't add a white color. So that's just an example to show you, to try to set it up so that you have overlapping bloom times. And those are going to change every year with the weather. So you have to really make sure they're overlapping and there's more than one thing overlapping. If there's not much rain that year, the blooms might not last as long, or they might start later. So you really have to, that's where also where annuals and herbs can come in handy, because they help you bridge some of those possible gaps. And there are also, then keep in mind, different flower types with different access to nectar. So we'll show you some specific examples when we're talking about different pollinators. But some things are big, some things are small, some things have short tongues, some have long tongues, some can land on anything, some need something kind of flat. So there are, having, again, all that variety and those differences in color, in bloom time, and in style of flower can really help maximize the number and type of pollinators you have in your yard. We mentioned earlier going with natives or as close to natives as you can get. Cultivars are flowers that have been selected and then bred, basically cloned, for the particular characteristics that they have. So in nature, coneflowers are basically pink or purple, but they have been, well, and I shouldn't say that because there are yellow ones that are a little bit different than the standard purple coneflowers. So breeders have gone about kind of mixing and matching those colors. Sometimes they find something in the wild that has one of those characteristics or has a slightly different color flower or different color leaf, and then they keep expanding on that. So the further you get away from it being native, usually the less nectar it has, because they don't, until recently, haven't been paying attention to nectar as they go through all these different breeding combinations. So if they're just trying to make a shrub smaller for yards, you know, there might not be an effect on the flowers as much. But if they're making it smaller and they want a different leaf color and they want more blooms, you know, the further and further you, the more steps they're taking and the more things that they're making different from the native, usually the less attractive it is for pollinators and other native insects. So another example is the big pom-pom coneflowers and zinnias, the double flowering things that you see on the right. And again, nectar is sacrificed for those flower parts. And it also is a lot more difficult for the insects to land on and even try to find the nectar if there is some. So you want to stick to not double flowering. That's not to say you can't have any in your yard, because I don't think there's a gardener that can resist some of these, but just that they're not predominant and that you have other options that are available for pollinators. Leaf change color is one of the few things that really has proven to be an issue. Some of the shrubs where they're coming out with dark purple, for the insects that usually eat the leaves, there's actually a chemical in there that makes it much less, I guess, worthwhile for the insect. And kind of the same thing with variegated leaves. It doesn't have that nutrition you have in a green leaf where the photosynthesized energy has gone. So kind of those white areas don't have as much nutrition. So they're not quite as attractive to the insects. So again, it's not to say that you can't have any, but it does have an effect on who's able to use them as food. This study is probably the best one I've seen that kind of talks about the natives versus cultivars and how pollinators visit which ones, how often, and where there are big differences. So there are probably about 3 big studies that have come out now, because those take a couple of years. And most of the things that Doug Tallamy from Bringing Nature Home is doing are species by species in the Mount Cuba gardens. So if you're curious, you can start to look those up. But the common answer is that the cultivar versus the native, it's about a 50-50 split. And as I said, it depends how far away from the original the cultivar is. So something that's very close may actually do better than the native. Like if you look at the Symphotrichum, which is asters, so the bluebird smooth aster rather than the regular smooth aster, you know, had 160 more pollinator visits. So some of these things are worthwhile, you know, to look for possibly that variety. Like I have October Skies Aster too, which I see a phenomenal number of small pollinators on, and it's a really beautiful flower. But then you look at when they took the New England Aster and turned it into the purple dome, which is a similar flower. It's very compact and very rounded. That has virtually no value to pollinators. So there's not a guarantee, you know, that the native is necessarily always better, but You just have to kind of play around with it and consult as they start to come out with some of these studies. And if you're curious, they have a lot of other lists in this study for bees, bugs, and blooms. If you just kind of search that in Penn State, you can come up with all the different tables. They have ones that were the most pollinator visits, just kind of going straight down the line, and a few other really interesting things. So in butterflies, if you want to bring them into your yard, they're just kind of nearsighted. They have eyes that look like flies, but unlike what you see for flies, where you see all the little same images in there, that's not the way that their eyes work. So they just kind of see these fuzzy color groups. So butterflies do not necessarily stay in your yard for very long. They're more likely to be flying through. So if you want to grab them and have them stop in your yard, you have to make it so they can see there's a lot of really good things in this yard. So planting in blocks of color is one of the best ways to do that. The other way to try to draw them into your yard for longer periods of time is to have host plant foods. So in most butterfly gardens, almost any article you read will have these same qualities that you want to have in your yard. Butterfly gardens, flowers, almost all need full sun. So do not plan to put your butterfly garden at the wood's edge. You may get a few butterflies there, but your plants aren't going to be blooming as strongly. And especially in the morning, insects need direct sunlight to warm up and be able to fly. So host plants are what I was talking about with caterpillars. So you want to get plants that caterpillars eat. So for example, black swallowtails eat almost anything in the caterpillar. So dill, fennel, parsley, golden alexanders is a native plant. So if you have those plants in your yard, it's more likely that you will have females stopping by to lay eggs. And oftentimes males, especially monarchs, will be patrolling around waiting for females to come. So if you have milkweed in your yard, which is the only food that monarch caterpillars can eat, you're much more likely to see both female and male monarchs, aside from once the caterpillars emerge and you have butterflies. Butterflies also need nectar plants. So that's a lot of talk. Now that everybody understands milkweed for monarchs, now it's okay, what nectar plants do you have for them, especially on their migration south as you get into August and September? So those are also important because that's what the butterflies themselves feed on, not the caterpillars. Sheltered, basically just having some windbreaks, whether that's from walls or shrubs or trees, so that they have some spaces where they can roost and hang out without getting all blown around on a windy day. This last thing, everybody always says water. There's a lot of talk about putting puddles and mud puddles and things in your yard. A lot of us that work with butterfly gardening, and I've talked nationally in chat groups, that basically they don't use anything we put in our yards. There's more than enough water around on the leaves with the dew, you know, however else they can get it. And puddling is really primarily a male behavior in the wild, and usually is groups of butterflies. We don't have usually whole masses of butterflies coming through our yards the way that you see them out in nature too. The type of plants that you're looking for butterflies, these are the ones they prefer. So single flowering daisy type flowers. You see the giant swallowtail on the top right, or within that area is Anazinnia, which is definitely a huge butterfly favorite. The white cabbage is in a purple cone flower, and on the bottom, the painted lady is on top of a Mexican sunflower, Tithonia. So each of those, you see kind of those little tubes in the middle, where those are where seeds come from also, and each of them is an individual little nectar spot. So the butterfly can take its long tongue and go into each of those. So it has a ton of nectar to get with one stop and a little bit of moving around. So that's a great situation for them. And it's the same thing with the types of flowers that you see on the right, either the umbel shaped, that's a Joe Pye weed with a red spotted on it. In the monarch on butterfly weed, and the tiger swallowtail is on a butterfly bush. So all of those have a whole bunch of little flowers that are easy to access and where the butterfly can sit for a while. Hummingbirds, on the other hand, are a little bit different. So they generally, as I mentioned, prefer things at either end of the color spectrum. Most people know red is a huge color for hummingbirds, but also orange and hot pink work as well. But then there's also a whole family of flowers in blues and purples that they will go to as well. But they don't tend to do as much in the middle. You know, they will do white, especially when penstemons are blooming kind of in June. So again, there's not, you know, kind of this either or never where animals and insects are concerned, but these are the things that are most attractive to them. They like the best value nectar possible. So I hear stories about people who see hummingbirds and petunias or million bells in their yard, and I'm like, boy, there must be nothing else nearby, because in my yard they would never come near that, because they have, you know, 20 plants that have much better nectar. And that little bird brain of theirs has very good memory for when they've been at those flowers, when they should return because the nectar will be there, and who's got the best flowers in the neighborhood. They are very good at sorting all that out. So they're always going for, you know, so sometimes it's great because you don't have to have a whole yard full of those kind of flowers. But if you have one or two of their absolute favorites, they're likely to hang around or at least stop by on their rounds every day. A lot of the hummingbird plants do not like clay soil. So you have to watch what you're putting where. Some of the annuals will do okay in our yards for that one summer. But some of them you have to put into containers or up on a berm or in a better well-drained soil area. I know some of you in Waukesha County actually have that, but most of us in the Milwaukee area do not. So you have to think sometimes about where you're putting those flowers. And also because hummingbirds generally prefer to be higher up the ground. You'll sometimes see them in those red bedding salvias, but they're very conscious of predators and they'd rather be away from cats and other things that might bother them lower down. So the photo that I have here is of a Salvia coccinea, which is just your basic kind of red salvia. It runs about a foot or a foot and a half. It's not as short as the bedding salvias. But the action that you will see that when you put it in a hanging basket versus planted in your ground, there's just a huge difference. The hummingbirds will definitely find it if it's up in the hanging basket, and you're likely to see them coming through and on it much more often. So we talked about they generally prefer long, thin flowers because they have less competition for that nectar. There aren't many insects that can access that unless they kind of cut through and cheat. So they have a better opportunity for that nectar to be there for them. So they take advantage of that with their long bills and their ability to fly up to things. On this page, you have an orange Cuphea in the upper left. Now, most commonly, it comes under Vermillionaire in the annual section. Black and salvias on the right, to the right of that, are one of their absolute favorites and easily available annual locally. So anything in the salvia is in the blue tones or the red tones, definitely that's something they will come and use. On the bottom left, you have red bee balm or monarda, which I think anybody who's had it understands instantly how attractive it is, not just for the bees, but for hummingbirds as well. Jacob Klein is a particular cultivar that they really like. And then underneath that is a penstemon. So those usually don't have quite as long a bloom time, but you will usually see hummingbirds in there. But then there are the exceptions. The red and hot pink zinnias, especially in a large grouping, are very attractive to hummingbirds. Now, it might also be just as likely that they're going after small insects that are in there as well as the nectar. Hummingbirds, actually, their diet consists both of insects and nectar. Nectar is kind of carbohydrates for all of these pollinators, but pollen is protein and insects are protein. So most of these, the insects and the birds are having a combination of them. And just to point out a little hummingbird ID for you, you see the one on the left with the orange flowers. You can see white tips on its tail there. We only have, for the most part, ruby hummingbird, ruby-throated hummingbirds in our area east of the Mississippi. And you can tell the males from the females, aside from the throat colors, is that males don't have that white tip on the edges. Females and juveniles do, and as the males get older, that white kind of disappears as they also gain their red neck feathers. Moving on to bees. We're going to give you some examples just so you can understand a little bit more about bees and start to recognize what's in your yard. There are two great bee citizen science programs. I've worked for a couple of years with the DNR identifying bumblebees. That's called Bumblebee Brigade. And that rusty patched bee on the bottom right is one of the prime targets. That is a federally endangered bumblebee, but it is relatively common in our area. Wisconsin is one of the last couple states where we have a real stronghold of them. So in southern Wisconsin, it's something you really want to be looking for. And if you happen to see it, try to submit the photos to Bumblebee Brigade because they really want to know where they're found. And it's actually a relatively urban bee. Some of these bumblebees seem to be doing better in our city gardens and areas than necessarily out on a prairie. So they're really looking for information on that. But in Wisconsin overall, we have 400 to 500 different bee species. And the other citizen science program is starting to work with that. Out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, there's an app called WIBee, or W-I-B, and that's to get people to help them identify other wild bees and where they are and what flowers they're on. So you can take advantage of that as well. And they give you some guidelines to help you figure out the bees, similar to what I'm doing here. Within those 400 to 500 bees that we have here, and they're discovering new ones all the time because people are finally paying attention to native bees. Honeybees are only one species. All the different honeybees that you see in the US are all the same species. So compared to all the other different types of bees they're just this little sliver. So there's an enormous variety to what's out there and the different type of bees that you might see. So as I mentioned, honeybees are not native bees. They came with the colonists, so they've been here for hundreds of years, but they are not native. 85 to 90% of the native bees, though, are solitary nesters. Bumblebees and a few other bees have colonies. They are not perennial or overwintering colonies like honeybees. They start fresh each year, but most of the bees that you see are just individual female bees building their own nests, laying eggs on their bee bread, which is a combination of nectar and pollen, sealing things up, and then when they've done as many nests as they can, they die, and it's up to the next generation. So solitary bees don't have these big colonies or nests to protect. And if they die, if you swat them and they die, then there's no more young for them. So their whole purpose has been defeated. So they tend to just ignore you as you're working around them. And on top of that, only female bees can sting. So really from the amount of bees that you see out there, and I am talking bees, not wasps, although there are a lot of solitary wasps also. It's only the social wasps that sting the same way you think about honeybees stinging. They sting to protect things. And for solitary bees, they just don't have that same investment. They also don't have, completely separate workers to defend the nest. So for a solitary bee, basically a female might lay 20 to 40 eggs in a couple different tunnels or stems, and they just produce, each individual cell or, division is for one egg. It's provided right there. The bee develops in that space, and then once it finishes pupating out, it will dig out or emerge from a stem. So it comes out as a full bee. Most of these bees only come out once a year around the same time and do all their reproductive work within a 1 to 3 week span. There are a few bees that might have multiple generations over the summer, but typically most of them is once a year. So when we say to leave nesting areas alone if you find them, or to try to give them some nesting areas, it really means leave them alone, because it's not a matter of just, okay, they'll be in and out in 2 or 3 weeks. They need to be there until the next year. So either they can dig in the ground and do tunnels individually or in a series of cells. It looks kind of like, the top of an anthill, but you'll see one bee coming in and out of that same hole. That's very different than a yellow jacket nest, for example, where you have multiple wasps coming in and out of the same hole. So again, these bees are solitary. It's one bee per nest. Some of them also nest in cavities. That's where you get bee houses and people talking about raising mason bees. So some of them will use empty stems, or in the case of a carpenter bee, which is the only one that can actually tunnel into wood like that, that they work with cavities and then have a series of individual cells in there. So just really quickly with bee nesting habitat, mostly they prefer warm, sandier soil. So right now you might have seen some of the mining bees coming out. They were in my yard, and I've talked to a couple of other people who were asking me, what are they? So they're kind of around for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they're done and taken care of. So for another full year. Grasses have kind of all that dead stuff at the base of it. And there are bees, some bumblebee species, and a number of other ones that like to take advantage of that. So it's another one of those things that you don't want to clean everything up. So ideally, you want to leave things a little messy. If there's old chipmunk holes around, bumblebees might use them. So the flip side of that is, if you know there are things right around your porch and you don't want to see bumblebees in your porch, but you've seen the chipmunks or some mice coming in and out, you might want to make sure that hole is filled up around now before the new bumblebee queens start looking around for spaces to go. And bumblebee nests are only good for 1 year. So, if you happen to find them late in the season, as things get more active, don't worry about it. They won't be there the next year. And it's actually the same thing with social wasp nests also. Everything for 1 year except for honeybees. The type of flowers that bees like, similar to butterflies, they like the flat single daisy style and the umbel shaped with a lot of small. Those are really great for small pollinators and beneficial insects, things like the herbs, dills, fennel, some of those things, but also big bees can use them as well. So those are what we call a generalist plant, where pretty much everybody will use them. Larger bees, like hummingbirds, have some specialty plants. They have more weight, their tongues can get in more, so they can work bigger flowers of bilateral, or what we call, they're the same on sides, things like snapdragons or the salvia or bee balm. So again, because it gives them an advantage, not every bee can get into there. Oftentimes that's where they go first, because they have the advantage there and there's more likely to be nectar there. Now, ways that they can cheat, I show you on the bottom, is that bumblebees with shorter tongues, or sometimes carpenter bees, will go in and chew a little hole out close to the nectar, and then smaller bees like the honeybee will come in behind there and take advantage of it. Just to give you some idea of how bees look compared to the other insects that you might confuse them with, the bumblebee that's in that upper left is a red-belted bumblebee. So it's one where you can see it has hair all the way down. They have 2 pairs of wings, and wasps also and moths also have 2 pairs of wings. And it's hairy. It can gather that pollen. And it has large eyes on the sides of its head, or they're spaced apart. Now you compare that to the syrphid or hoverfly below it, which they try to mimic bees in order to have everybody think that they're as dangerous as bees are. but usually they have big eyes, small antenna, and they're typically very smooth with a couple of exceptions. So they don't look actually like bees when you take a little closer look at them. As hummingbird moths fly around, people think they're bees. The one that's shown here, the snowberry clearwing hummingbird moth, actually has a body that looks like a bee, but I call them the flying shrimp. They have that little fuzzy tail at the end, and they have a little bit different look to them, and they're bigger than most bees also. Wasps are very closely related to bees. Basically, the evolutionary change seems to be that bees are wasps that have gone vegetarian. And as a result of that, they picked up all that hair and ways to gather nectar and pollen. Wasps don't need that. So they're relatively hairless. They have usually a pretty thin waist, longer legs, and thinner wings that they often hold out a little more to the sides than bees. So that's a paper wasp that I've shown there. And just to kind of distinguish between the bees, when I first started reading about bees, they were talking tongue length and families and all kinds of things that I couldn't sort out in the field or try to understand. You know, I'm not going to look at bees with a microscope or figure that out. So I started to kind of separate them by where they hold the pollen and where you see that. So there's a couple of families where it's on the underside of their abdomen like that. And there are everybody else has it on their legs. So for honeybees and bumblebees, they can hold it in a particular pollen basket. For the other bees, they just have longer hairs that they hold it in. And there are actually some bees that you don't see any pollen on. You know, a female, that can happen, you know, if you happen to catch them before they've got a lot collected. But male bees don't collect pollen. They just feed as they go. They get to lollygag around, do whatever they want once their mating deal is done. And also cuckoo bees that are like cuckoo birds, that they lay their eggs in the nest of other bees. So they're not going around collecting pollen either. So the three that collected on their abdomen, these are just some examples. Probably the one you're most likely to run into is leafcutter bees. If you have roses, or there are a couple of other shrubs that they really like, and you see all those little part circles carved out, that's not a pest you have to worry about. They're just collecting leaf material to do their nesting. They line their individual cells and divide the cells with those leaf pieces. The carder bee that's shown here is the European one. That can be, the males are very aggressive in protecting plants. If you have any lamb's ear, you may have seen them. The carder bees use those kind of silvery strands as material for their nesting. So things like lamb's ear that have that kind of a leaf, that's where you usually find them. And a lot of people have been talking about mason bees. Those houses were originally called mason bee houses. But for most of us, if you don't have an orchard in your yard, you're probably not going to see them very often. They really, for the most part, prefer to be pollinating spring fruit trees. So you may have them in the area, but it's not quite as easy as people thought, at least for a lot of our urban environments, to see them. So just as an example with the leafcutter, this is the kind of lifestyle that an individual female solitary bee has. It's a whole heck of a lot of work. They make a lot of trips to build that nest. Then they have to provide the nectar and the pollen for their egg. They usually sleep there because I'm sure they're exhausted doing that all day. And they actually are pretty small cells. So within a couple of hollow twigs, you can have their entire lifetime production. I mentioned before the two species that have these pollen baskets, and it's just kind of a concave area in their leg where they ball up nectar and pollen and hold it there until they fly back and drop it off.
Settle down.
So you can see the leg hairs that help hold it on the back of the bumblebee in that instance. And then for other bees, they just have these extra long hairs that kind of have barbs and a little bit of static electricity where the pollen grabs onto them. And sometimes you'll actually see bees stopping and grooming to put the pollen into those areas where they're collecting it. So just to show you some quick examples of honeybees and bumblebees, they are the two major social bees. But bumblebee colonies start over again every year. So they're not quite as big and they don't overwinter like honeybees do. So right now you'll see the new bumblebee queens flying around, both feeding and trying to find a new place to nest for this year. So they're just emerging now as the weather's changing. Hopefully, not many of them emerged before the snow, but this is pretty typical for this time of year, and this is when they do start emerging. So the other thing that people often have questions on is carpenter bees, because they look a lot like bumblebees. This is the one where you might see males hovering a lot. You see these big bees that might dive bomb you, and that's actually the males who can't sting, who may be protecting a nesting area for females in some nearby wood. So you can tell the difference. They always have that same color pattern, which actually happens to match one type of bumblebee, except that their abdomen is all black and shiny. So, and their head is also a lot wider and different, but they do look somewhat like bumblebees. And then lastly, it's just kind of a quick selection of a few of the types of bees that collect pollen on their legs. So you can see some examples here. The ones that we're starting to see now are usually mining bees, Andrena, and a few other types, and the cellophane bees that you see on the left. Both of those are digging solitary bees that can come in a couple different color combinations. The sweat bees will start coming out soon, and they're very, very tiny. And they come either in green with a striped abdomen, solid green. So if you see a little green bee of any sort, it's likely to be a sweat bee. Then they also have some of that same pattern with brown tops and black tops. And then some of my favorites, the longhorn bees. So that's the male with the big long antenna that gives them their name. But the females have short antenna and usually legs just full of pollen on coreopsis and sunflowers and daisies, like you see here. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I really appreciate you coming here to learn more about pollinators. Here are some additional resources through Extension. For our main sites, the horticulture site and the learning store, they all have search boxes, so you can search for things. For example, in the learning store, there's a great article about native bees that gives you some plant lists also that are specific to Wisconsin. So there's lots of ways to look up more information as well. Does anybody have questions, Carrie?
No questions on the chat. I don't know if anybody has any questions otherwise. If you do, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. We'll give you some time for that. Maybe there's no questions. That was a lot about bees. Whew.
Well, I understand I throw a lot of information at you. Hopefully that's enough to give you a great start in figuring out what to plant and being able to understand a little bit of what you start to see in your yard.
Sure. We do have a question. Mary's asking, are all kinds of milkweed okay, or just the common kind of milkweed?
Oh, no, all kinds. You know, common milkweed for most of us is something that goes into the back of our yard or behind our garage or in our alley. But it's perfectly fine, you know, to put in your yard too, but it does send out a lot of runners. So the most garden friendly milkweed is swamp milkweed. It also goes by rose or red. Because it doesn't need wet conditions. It does fine in garden conditions, and it has a much narrower leaf and a pretty pink flower, and it doesn't have that same propensity to really run. If you'd like the look of common milkweed, and actually the flowers smell really great as well, there's something that's a little more garden friendly called prairie milkweed or Sullivan's milkweed. If you have drier soils, butterfly milkweed is with the bright orange flowers is a really great plant. I have it planted in kind of that little hell strip between my brick house and my driveway. I have about a foot, and it loves being there with all that heat and the crappy soil. So different milkweeds take different conditions. So you have different options depending on where they are in your yard. There's even one for shade called poke milkweed. It's not as readily available, but you can find it once in a while.
I think I have the swamp milkweed. It's very tall.
It's about 3.5 feet tall usually.
Yes,
Yeah.
but the flowers are very pretty.
Yeah, the flowers attract a lot of different pollinators and interesting things, and it does also, it kind of gets a little bit of bare knees as the summer goes on, so it's good to have a few shorter things in front of it to kind of cover that as leaves drop off on the bottom or get eaten by caterpillars. It's probably the second milkweed that monarchs go to. Usually the first one is the common milkweed, but they prefer leaves that are soft and tender. And so as the common milkweed gets bigger and those leaves get a little bit tougher, they move on to swamp milkweed usually, or butterfly milkweed. So
Cool.
I have a question.
sure.
In one of your photos, I saw what I believe was Asclepias curassavica, tropical milkweed.
Yes.
How do you feel about planting that in this particular geographical climatological area?
Yeah, it's not as much of an issue here as down south.
Understood.
I travel to Florida in the winter where I see monarchs, year round. So really this, to some extent, the same thing with butterfly bush, where it's more invasive,
Right.
is other areas of the country where it recedes, it doesn't die down. So the real issue is with the OE parasite that
Right.
can infect monarch
course.
caterpillars. And what happens down south is that those plants don't die down like they do here.
Yeah.
So that OE can stay on the leaves and continues to build up and affect more monarch caterpillars. Here, it dies off and it can reseed in yards. I've experienced that a little bit, and other people have also. So I will admit I'm not a purist about it here because it does die down. It is one though that you have to be careful where you're buying it. Also because it may be treated with neonicotinoids, which is a systemic pesticide, insecticide that's put in there. Yeah, so especially if it happens to be offered at a big box store, watch to see if they have a little tag in it that says that it has neonics on it. So I'm pretty careful about where I buy it. It's actually pretty easy to grow too.
Well, I got mine from Jim Price, who I know you know.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, who's the one who told me, oh, it just reseeds everywhere, and I was like, no, it doesn't. And now I've started to find it,
Yeah.
as I've looked a little bit more. So it is another one that's nice and tender for them. There are a lot of monarchs that lay eggs on it. So it really just depends, what your sense is of how native you want to be or not.
And it really is a stunning flower.
Yes. Yes.
For any of you who haven't seen it, you should the photos never quite do it justice, but look online and find pictures of tropical milkweed, curassavica.
Yeah, it's also a favorite of some little carpenter bees and little wasps that I often see on it as well. So it's definitely an interesting plant, but it is an annual. So
Up here, yes.
yes.
Okay. I'll have to look at that one. Does anybody else have any more questions? We've got a lot of people saying thank you on chat. Thank you guys for
thank you
everything.
again. I appreciate you stopping by to hear about pollinators.
Yeah, this was a really great presentation, Jennifer. Thank you so much for being here and presenting again.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm already thinking about how I can redo my yard.
Well, that's always the goal. Take your time, have fun with it. Some years are better than others for butterflies, so don't be discouraged. One of my first years that I really expanded and went after doing a lot of butterfly things was 2012. which was a year, almost unlike no other in recent history. So I had all kinds of butterflies all over the place all the time, and I thought it was always going to be like that. So, but the more that you build in your yard, the more likely they are to come. And sometimes just having that, black swallowtail stop by on all your hot pink, usually they're on phlox or dianthus. There's something called jolt that they're really attracted to. Just walking out your door and seeing that can really make your day. So.
I agree. We do have one more quick question here. Someone's asking if the handouts will be available. Can you make those available to me?
Sure, I can send you the link. As I said, I think the only one that I mentioned was the Bugs Blooms, Bees Bugs Blooms. And if you just search for that, you usually run into the tables there. You may have to add Pennsylvania or Penn State to get you directly there, but that one's really easy to find if you just Google it.
Okay.
But yeah, if you want me to send anything, just let me know and I'd be happy to do that.
Okay. Yeah, maybe send that link if you have it. That would be great.
Okay.
And then I can put it up on the Facebook page. And I'll also include it in the recording of this, which will be posted on the library's YouTube page as well. So we'll have those there for you.
That is a great book, Wolfgang. I hope you're working your way through it. The other person.
It's a long task.
Yeah, Ohio State just had some great seminars about a month ago that they had the author of that, one of the authors of that book, Olivia Carroll, and also Heather Holm, who does a great book on bees and native plants. And there's 2 new books out. There's a solitary bees book by a different professor, and Heather Holm has done a new solitary wasp book, or she's done the social and the solitary wasp together. So some of those talks were great for hearing the authors talk about what they'd written and figuring out, okay, is that a book worth investing in too?
Cool. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I think I will end the program. Again, thank you so much, Jennifer. This was amazing.
Oh, absolutely. Happy to do it. I hope everybody has a great summer gardening.
I do too. Thank you all for stopping by. Have a good evening.